By mid-1944, the Eastern Front was undergoing a structural shift that set the conditions for the summer fighting in Galicia and toward the Vistula. The Red Army had crossed the Dnieper in 1943 to 1944 and pushed through right-bank Ukraine during the spring Proskurov-Chernovtsi and Koval operations, creating salients that threatened German transport lines running from Silesia and Krakow to Army Group North Ukraine. On the 22nd of June 1944, Operation Bagration began in Belarus, drawing German reserves northward and weakening the sector's opposite First Ukrainian Front. The German High Command retained the designation Army Group North Ukraine for formations covering western Ukraine and southeastern Poland, with 4th Panzer Army on the northern wing and 1st Panzer Army farther south. To their right, Hungarian forces guarded approaches through the Carpathians. The German goal in this region was to preserve the industrial and rail corridor from Upper Silesia to Krakow and Przemysl, prevent a Soviet crossing of the Vistula, and maintain lateral links with formations in the Balkans. The Soviet aim, assigned to First Ukrainian Front under I.S. Konev, was to break the defense in depth in eastern Galicia, retake Lviv and the oil and communication hub at Drohobych-Stry, reach the San and Vistula rivers, seize bridgeheads on the western bank, and set conditions for advances on Krakow and Silesia. Command relationships and available tools reflected these objectives. Konev's front assembled multiple combined arms armies supported by 2 tank armies and 2nd Air Army for sustained offensive operations. The German side organised mobile reserves under Panzer Corps headquarters to react along major axes: Brody Lviv, Rawaruska Lublin, and Stanisławiów-Stryj. German defensive planning emphasized elastic defense where possible, but fixed positions around key towns, river lines, and road junctions remained central because of rail nodes at Lviv, Przemysl, Yaroslavl, and Sandomierz. The Soviet staff, drawing on winter and spring experience, concentrated artillery and engineer assets to breach multiple belts rather than a single rupture point, with Maskirovka measures to obscure the main effort and with pre-planned second echelon tank exploitation once infantry armies opened passages. Geopolitical and political factors shaped operational urgency. For Moscow, liberating Western Ukraine had military and state significance. Removal of German forces from the Ukrainian SSR's last major regions, restoration of communications toward Poland, and a demonstration of sustained offensive capacity alongside Bagration. For Berlin, holding Galicia shielded Silesian coal and industry, the Krakow-Katowice base area, and the approaches to the Upper Oder. The region also covered lines to the southeast, where the German command sought to retain influence in Hungary and secure access to oil. These aims translated into directives to keep a continuous front and to counterattack with available armour when Soviet penetrations appeared, even as higher-level reserves were being absorbed by crises farther north. Intelligence and estimates on both sides indicated an unequal but not decisive balance. Soviet aerial reconnaissance and partisan-supplied reports mapped German fieldworks east of Lviv and along the Bug and San. The German command collected indications of Soviet rail buildups east of Ternopil and Koval, but the simultaneous collapse of Army Group Center limited the ability to reposition strong mechanized reserves into Galicia before the Soviet opening. Both sides identified key terrain: river obstacles such as the western Bug, San, and Vistula, the urban complex of Lviv with converging rail, and the wooded rolling country that constrained wide armoured manoeuvre, but permitted rapid infantry artillery advances once a sector broke. Summer weather favoured operations, but swollen tributaries and bridges with limited load classification required dedicated engineer support. Public sentiment and civilian conditions were complex. The population of eastern Galicia and western Ukraine in 1944, included Ukrainians and Poles under German occupation, with recent mass violence affecting interethnic relations and partisan activities. Jewish communities had been largely destroyed earlier in the occupation. Soviet liberation was understood by many civilians as the end of German rule. Others anticipated renewed conscription, requisition, and state security measures. On the German side, local authorities prepared emergency evacuations of administrative personnel and material from larger towns if Soviet forces reached the outskirts. Civil rail traffic diminished as military requirements took priority. Material readiness framed the coming offensive. The Red Army restored broad-gauge lines forward of the Dniester and Bug, moving artillery ammunition, bridging equipment and replacement tanks to assembly areas behind 13th, 60th, and 38th Armies and the tank armies. Airfields for 2nd Air Army were reconfigured to support concentrated sorties during the opening artillery preparation and to interdict German road movements toward Lviv and Rava-Ruska. Repair depots for T-34s and self-propelled guns were positioned along main east-west routes to shorten turnaround times. The Wehrmacht reinforced anti-tank defences along approaches to Lviv and Brody with 75mm and 88mm guns, created mine belts, and distributed assault gun battalions to threatened core sectors, while keeping mobile groups under army control for counterattacks against any Soviet breakthrough. Doctrinal practice informed the plans. Soviet operational art in 1944 prescribed sequential operations. A first phase to break tactical defense with infantry-artillery groupings. A second phase for tank armies to exploit toward operational depths and river crossings, and a third to establish and expand bridgeheads for later offensives. German doctrine emphasized counterstroke by armor against overextended spearheads, and the holding of river lines to trade space for time provided lateral communications and fuel stocks remained intact. Air power on both sides was expected to influence the tempo at daylight, with night movements protected by camouflage and dispersal. Finally, casualty expectations and force rotation policies were recorded in staff planning. Soviet documents anticipated heavy personnel and equipment expenditure during the initial breach and urban fighting in and around Lviv, with medical echelons staged along predetermined evacuation corridors and replacement battalions assigned to maintain divisional strength. German staffs projected high losses in infantry divisions already reduced by spring actions, planning to stabilize with local reserves and panzer counterattacks, to buy time for withdrawal to the San and, if necessary, the Vistula. These preconditions, strategic aims, force posture, logistics, terrain, and political imperatives, defined the framework within which the July-August operation would commence, determine its pace, and shape the costs that later statistical summaries would record. The operation opened before dawn on July 13, 1944, with synchronized artillery preparations along multiple sectors from the Kovel-Rava-Ruska axis to approaches east of Lviv. Front headquarters assigned the first blow to infantry army groupings with pre-planned breaches 6 to 12 kilometers wide, supported by engineer assault detachments and close air support from 2nd Air Army. On the northern wing, Soviet formations moved on Rava-Ruska to split German defences facing the Bug crossings. South of this, assaults pressed on Beresteshko-Brody. Farther south, shock groups advanced on Zolokiv and the outer defence ring of Lviv. The opening fire plan used rolling barrages and counter-battery concentrations to neutralise German artillery on identified firing lines, with additional mortars tasked to suppress fortified localities on road junctions that had been mapped by reconnaissance in June. German forward regiments reported heavy fire damage to wire, trenches, and command posts within the first hour, but localized resistance remained in villages that formed nodes of the defense. The German staff attempted an elastic response where ground permitted, pulling back outposts to prepared lines and feeding in assault guns against Soviet spearheads at road cuts and tree lines. However, the requirement to hold rail approaches and bridges limited the freedom to yield ground near Reva-Ruska and the Brody road net. Communications along lateral routes degraded under interdiction strikes, and battalion-level counterattacks lacked the fuel and ammunition reserves needed to restore forward positions once Soviet infantry had captured the initial trench lines. By 14 to 15 July, Soviet infantry armies had widened the breaches and reported passage lanes suitable for mechanized exploitation. Konev ordered the commitment of mobile echelons on the principal axes. One tank army was directed toward Rava-Ruska to unhinge the northern flank of 4th Panzer Army, and another toward Zolochiv-Brody to split the junction between German corps. Engineer brigades pushed bridge parks forward to cross minor streams, while road commandant units organized traffic to sustain continuous movement of tanks, self-propelled guns, and ammunition columns. Airfields east of Ternopil supported concentrated sorties onto road junctures behind German 1st Echelon divisions, with fighter cover assigned to protect bridgeheads forming over tributaries of the Bug. German commanders concentrated available armour into counterstroke groups with a mission to strike Soviet tank columns as they emerged from wooded corridors. Panzer and Panzergrenadier elements, supported by anti-tank guns and mines, carried out short, sharp attacks designed to stall the Soviet pace and buy time for the establishment of a new line covering Lviv's eastern approaches. Several such engagements temporarily recovered localities or delayed Soviet bridge construction, but fuel stocks and attrition in tanks reduced the ability to maintain pressure. Reports from Army headquarters noted growing difficulty maintaining a continuous front as gaps opened between divisions under combined artillery and air attack. On 16th to 17th July, Soviet spearheads reached the depth of German second positions in the Brody sector. Encroaching advances north and south of the town threatened to close a pocket around several German divisions and supporting units. The German command authorized withdrawals to shorten the line, but repeated delays in disengagement under fire, combined with the loss of road control to Soviet forward detachments, left elements of a corps vulnerable to encirclement. Soviet staff sought to seal the emerging pocket with motorized infantry and attached anti-tank artillery, while airborne reconnaissance and partisans reported German attempts to break westward via forest tracks and secondary roads. East of Lviv, the opening phase turned into a series of deliberate reductions of fortified villages and strong points covering the city's outer ring. Soviet infantry advanced with close artillery support and assault engineers, clearing street by street in small towns and using flamethrowers and satchel charges against reinforced cellars. The German side committed reserves to hold key elevations and crossroads, focusing on delaying actions to allow heavy materiel and administrative services to evacuate westward. Civilian movement increased along roads leading away from the city, complicating military traffic and prompting both sides to establish route control points to separate columns. On the northern axis, pressure toward Rava-Ruska disrupted German use of the rail junction for supply and troop movements. Soviet forward detachments cut branch lines and blew culverts, while air units struck trains and station yards. German efforts to reroute supplies through alternative nodes faced the same constraints as the rest of the front: destroyed bridges, damaged locomotives, and a growing shortage of motor transport. The net effect by the end of the first week was a marked decline in German ability to reinforce threatened sectors, while Soviet formations recorded a steady, if uneven advance measured in kilometers gained and defensive belts crossed. Casualties in the opening phase reflected the nature of the fighting. Soviet infantry divisions reported high losses in assault companies and engineer units tasked with breaching minefields and storming strongpoints. Tank units recorded combat write-offs and mechanical attrition from continuous movement and limited maintenance halts. German infantry divisions experienced rapid erosion in frontline strength, particularly in battalions subjected to combined artillery and air bombardment followed by close combat. Armour losses occurred in counterstroke engagements where Soviet anti-tank guns, self-propelled guns, and tank ambushes intersected German attack routes. medical echelons on both sides operated at capacity, with evacuation chains stretching over damaged roads. The command picture at the end of the opening phase showed diverging trends. Soviet staffs reported that the initial objectives, breaching first and second defensive lines, disrupting key junctions, and enabling tank armies to operate in the German rear, had been achieved on several axes. German reports emphasized the necessity of establishing a new defensive line tied to river obstacles and urban positions, while extracting isolated units under pressure. The battlefield was shifting westward, and with it, the focus of both sides. The Soviets on sealing encirclements and preparing to enter Lviv's inner defenses. The Germans on organizing breakouts, staging counterstrokes where feasible, and preventing a roll-up of the front toward the San and the Vistula. The strategic intentions behind the Lvov-Sandomierz operation were defined in parallel at two opposing headquarters, Stavka in Moscow and the Oberkommando des Heers, OKH, in East Prussia, each calculating time, geography, and resources differently. For the Soviet command, the operation was an extension of the momentum created by Operation Bagration in Belarus. With Army Group Center collapsing to the north, Stavka's directive to Marshal Ivan Konev on June 24th emphasized immediate exploitation, a deep breakthrough through western Ukraine toward the Vistula, not only to liberate Lviv and the industrial regions of Drohobych and Stray, but to open a direct route into southern Poland. Konev's front was to coordinate with the First Belarusian Front, advancing toward Lublin and Warsaw, thereby threatening the entire depth of German defences in Central Europe. The Soviet plan consisted of two main shock groupings. In the north, 3rd Guards, 13th and 60th Armies, supported by 1st Guards Tank Army, were to rupture the line along Rava Ruska and seize crossings over the Western Bug. In the south, 1st Guards and 18th Armies, supported by 4th Tank Army, would attack towards Stanislavov and Drohobych to prevent German withdrawal into the Carpathians. Between them, 38th and 60th Armies with attached corps from 3rd Guards would take Lviv itself. The operation was to develop in depth for up to 300 kilometers within 3 to 4 weeks, a demanding tempo requiring uninterrupted logistics, fresh reserves, and strong air support. Konev's calculations relied on detailed logistical preparation begun months earlier. The Red Army's rail engineers had rebuilt standard gauge lines across the Bug and Dniester to feed forward depots stocked with over 200,000 tons of ammunition, 150,000 tons of fuel, and 350,000 tons of food and engineering material. Roads were reinforced with corduroy and gravel surfaces to sustain 30 to 40 divisions, advancing simultaneously. Mobile repair battalions were distributed among the tank armies, while bridge trains equipped with pontoon and trestle sets were prepositioned near the Steyr and Bug rivers. The coordination between front, army, and corps echelons was codified in pre-battle orders down to timetable precision. Infantry was to advance 5 to 7 kilometers on the first day, tanks 20 to 30 kilometers once passages were cleared, with the objective of encircling German corps near Brody by the 5th day. In contrast, the German strategic posture reflected a mix of doctrinal consistency and crisis management. Army Group North Ukraine, commanded by General Oberst Josef Harp, reported a total of around 400,000 men, of which only half were effective combat troops after months of attrition. Its 4th Panzer Army fielded 10 divisions, including the 16th and 17th Panzer, while 1st Panzer Army held the southern wing with 7 divisions. The defensive system relied on multiple belt lines, an advanced screen of outposts, a main defense zone with field fortifications, and rear strongpoints along rail junctions and rivers. However, construction lagged far behind orders issued in April, and many positions lacked sufficient wire, mines, and communications. German intelligence estimated Soviet strength opposite Lviv at around 800,000 men, 1,500 tanks, and 11,000 guns, figures still below reality. Luftwaffe reconnaissance noted airfield expansion near Ternopil and Lutsk, Yet reports were interpreted as standard summer rotation. When Soviet artillery opened fire on July 13th, Harp's staff was still adjusting deployment plans. The overall concept, drafted by OKH and confirmed by Hitler's directive of June 25th, prioritized holding all Ukrainian territory east of the Vistula, effectively forbidding large-scale withdrawal. Hitler's command style, increasingly rigid after the losses in Belarus, constrained flexibility. Divisions were ordered to defend fortified places to the last man, a doctrine designed to delay Soviet advances, but that risked encirclement once breakthroughs occurred. Resource allocation reinforced this asymmetry. Soviet artillery densities reached 250 to 300 guns per kilometre on main axes, while German counter-battery strength rarely exceeded 40 to 50. Soviet tank production had replenished stocks with new T-3485s and Su-85 self-propelled guns. German formations contained a mix of Panthers, Panzerverfolgers, and assault guns, but with limited fuel reserves. The Luftwaffe's 8th Air Corps could muster only about 400 aircraft for the entire sector, facing more than 2,000 Soviet planes of Second Air Army. Strategic communications between German field commanders and OKH reflected a growing disconnect. Harp and 1st Panzer Army Commander General Gotthard Heinrizi repeatedly requested permission to realign the front along the San and Vistula to conserve strength. Berlin refused, citing political and morale considerations. The loss of Lviv, Hitler argued, would signal to allies in Hungary and Romania that Germany could no longer defend Eastern Europe. Consequently, orders from Führer headquarters on July 8th directed the army group to hold Lviv at all costs, a phrase that would determine the fate of entire corps a week later. The Soviet side, by contrast, maintained flexible coordination among fronts. Konev communicated daily with Rokossovsky's 1st Belarusian Front to synchronize flanking operations and ensure continuity along the Vistula line. The Soviet General Staff under Antonov anticipated that, should Lviv fall quickly, Konev's mobile groups would exploit northward towards Sandomierz rather than pause for consolidation. The emphasis was on exploiting German disorganization, a shift from the earlier attritional style of 1941 to 1942 toward the operational maneuver warfare that characterized Soviet offensives of 1944. Propaganda and public presentation differed accordingly. In the Soviet Union, the operation was described in internal bulletins as part of the final liberation of Ukrainian land, linking the campaign to political objectives of post-war reconstruction. In Germany, official communiqué minimized Soviet successes and emphasized fierce resistance of steadfast divisions. Civilian populations in Galicia received contradictory messages. Soviet leaflets promised liberation and safety, while German occupation authorities spoke of defending Europe from Bolshevism. Behind both messages lay a reality of total mobilization. Railways overloaded with troop movements, bridges mined, and villages turned into field fortifications. By mid-July, both headquarters understood that the confrontation would not be a brief engagement, but a decisive contest for control of southeastern Poland. Stavka viewed it as the southern counterpart to Bagration, a step toward the Vistula and the borders of Germany itself. For the German command, it was the last chance to stabilize the front before the loss of the eastern industrial hinterland. The plans set in motion would soon collide with the unpredictability of the battlefield. Local successes magnified by breakthroughs, and isolated defences transformed into pockets of destruction. The next phase, the battle around Brody and the struggle for Lviv, would reveal how strategy on paper met the realities of command under continuous attack. Initial contact along the whole front on July 13th to 14th produced uneven results that quickly clarified the axes of decision. North of the main road net, infantry of the 13th and 60th Armies pushed through prepared trenches with coordinated rolling barrages, while assault engineers cut gaps in minefields under smoke. The assault echelons advanced behind lines of T-3485s and Su-76, tasked to neutralize bunkers and heavy machine gun nests. German forward battalions used pre-planned withdrawals to second positions, trading ground for time and concentrating PaK-40 anti-tank guns at choke points where the road exited woodland. Where terrain allowed, Stugi 3 batteries executed short counterattacks against Soviet spearheads, then slipped back under cover of 81mm mortar fire. By evening of the first day, Soviet units reported penetrations of 4 to 8 kilometers on several sectors and seizure of road junctions east of Zolochiv and along approaches to Rava-Ruska, while German reports emphasized the need to restore command links cut by artillery and air interdiction. On the Brody axis, the first serious engagements developed around villages that anchored the German main line. Soviet artillery regiments massed 100 22mm and 152mm guns for counter-battery fire and used BM-13 launchers to disorganize assembly areas. The infantry advanced in battalion columns, each with an attached sapper company, and marked lanes for the following tanks with colored flags to expedite traffic control. German local reserves countered with mixed Kampfgruppen built around Panzer IVs and Panthers from nearby panzer regiments, supported by armoured reconnaissance cars to probe Soviet flanks. Several engagements ended with Soviet tanks forced to halt at anti-tank ditches or collapsed bridges, allowing German guns to score hits at 600 to 800 metre ranges. Nevertheless, repeated infantry assaults under heavy artillery gradually displaced the defence from several strongpoints, creating the preconditions for a deeper push toward the road ring around Brody. Civilian impact in these opening days was immediate. Columns of carts left villages near the intended battle zones, while town administrations organised the evacuation of archives and supplies westward by rail. In Lviv, air raid alarms and the visible loading of wagons at the Kleparev and Persenkivka yards signalled the beginning of an administrative drawdown. Local police and German military patrols diverted civilian traffic away from roads designated for troop movements, but refugee streams occasionally intersected with retreating units, slowing withdrawal. Soviet leaflets dropped over rural areas, urged inhabitants to shelter in cellars and avoid roadways, while partisans provided guides through forest tracks to bypass blown bridges. Morale responses diverged. Soviet rifle divisions reported high confidence after the first belts were taken, aided by the visible commitment of tank formations and frequent overflights by 2nd Air Army fighter bombers. At the same time, casualty reports in assault companies and sapper units indicated the cost of direct attacks on fortified houses and churchyards that had been converted into strong points. German division logs recorded fatigue from continuous artillery fire and requests for additional ammunition and fuel. Commanders noted that veteran companies could still mount effective counterattacks, but replacements lacked cohesion under bombardment. Communication breakdowns at battalion level increased as field telephones were cut and runners could not cross open ground. By 15th to 16th July, Soviet forward detachments, motorized rifle battalions, reinforced with self-propelled guns and engineers, moved beyond the lines of initial fortifications, attempting to seize bridges and high ground ahead of the main body. On the northern axis toward Rava-Ruska, these detachments cut the lateral road to Uchniv and damaged sidings at the rail junction with demolition charges. Luftwaffe sorties attacked bridge parks and columns on the march, but the number of available aircraft limited the duration of these efforts. Soviet fighters maintained daylight cover for bridging sites and railway yards feeding the offensive, allowing continuous throughput of ammunition and fuel. The emerging pocket around Brody had its roots in these first engagements. Soviet advances north of the town penetrated past Olesko and toward the M06 highway, while to the south, infantry and tanks gained footholds along the T-3009 route. German efforts to close the gaps were hampered by conflicting directives, hold prepared positions near the town, and simultaneously mount counterattacks to restore a continuous front. 13th Army Corps headquarters, led by General Arthur Hoff, attempted to coordinate withdrawals to shorter lines. But several divisions were engaged at close quarters and lacked the transport to disengage in good order. The presence of the 14th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS, composed largely of locally recruited personnel and subordinated to the Corps, added complexity to the command picture. Its regiments were committed piecemeal to plug breaches and suffered heavy losses in village fighting. Unexpected outcomes appeared at the micro level. In some sectors, German mine belts remained intact and delayed Soviet tanks for hours, allowing artillery to reoccupy positions under cover of smoke. In others, rapid sapper work and local partisan guides opened minor forest tracks that brought Soviet advance guards onto the German flanks earlier than anticipated. A bridge the German engineers intended to blow at a key stream crossing was captured intact when Soviet infantry infiltrated along a drainage ditch at dawn, enabling the passage of a tank battalion that then cut the secondary road west of Brody. Conversely, a Soviet column lost a dozen vehicles to a concealed pack front arrayed along a hedgerow after outrunning its infantry support. These small engagements aggregated into operational trends that favoured the attacker as gaps widened and the steadiness of lateral communications eroded. East of Lviv, the clash took on the character of block-by-block reduction of outlying settlements. Soviet regiments advanced with direct-fire guns and flamethrower teams to clear stone buildings, while German companies fought delaying actions from basements and upper floors, withdrawing under smoke to the next prepared locality. The city's inner defences were not yet fully engaged, but the outer ring was being tested continuously, compelling the German command to commit reserves that might otherwise have reinforced the Brody sector. Tram services were suspended, hospitals expanded triage areas, and field kitchens served both military and civilian wounded in improvised shelters. Equipment performance figures from both sides illustrated the trade-offs. Soviet tank brigades recorded increased mechanical failures after continuous road marches, particularly in transmissions stressed by frequent start-stop movements in constricted terrain. German armoured units reported a rising share of non-combat losses due to fuel shortages and the difficulty of recovering damaged vehicles under artillery observation. Artillery ammunition expenditure on the Soviet side exceeded planned daily rates on the first and third days, requiring emergency forward delivery by night convoys. German counter-battery units depleted stockpiles of high-explosive shells and requested priority rail resupply that could not be met due to interdiction. By the end of the initial week, the first engagements had produced clear territorial shifts. Soviet forces stood on the outskirts of Lviv's outer defences and had compromised the road network feeding Brody from the west. The northern wing pressed toward Rava-Ruska, threatening to unhinge the German line anchored on the western Bug. German formations retained pockets of resistance and mounted localized counterattacks, but their ability to maneuver as a coherent front was declining. The local civilian environment adjusted to the new realities. Villages emptied, traffic control points multiplied, and railway schedules gave way to emergency troop movements. The clash had begun not with a single decisive blow, but with a series of coordinated breaches whose cumulative effect set the conditions for encirclement and the battles that would follow around Brody and within the urban approaches to Lviv. Escalation followed quickly as both commands tried to convert local gains and stave off collapse. Between July 17th and 20th, Soviet axes diverged and then converged again, widening gaps in the German line while fixing reserves by pressure on multiple points. Infantry armies expanded salient shoulders north and south of Brody, while forward detachments seized crossings over minor streams to facilitate the entry of tank armies. The German side attempted to reconstitute a continuous front by pulling back forward regiments to prepared lines, but withdrawals under fire produced intervals where no formed units held the ground. These intervals became channels for Soviet reconnaissance and artillery observation, allowing precise strikes on command posts and road junctions that further degraded coordination. Command challenges multiplied. On the German side, 13th Army Corps faced divergent tasks: hold outer positions east of Brody, extract units already engaged in village defence, and maintain a corridor westward for heavy equipment. Signals traffic recorded frequent changes of orders as reports arrived of Soviet thrusts reaching successive roads. Corps tried to form a relief group with available armour from neighbouring formations, but assembling Kampfgruppen required stripping tanks from sectors also under attack. On the Soviet side, front headquarters had to decide how much armour to commit to the encirclement versus retaining strength for a later push toward the San and Vistula. Orders on July 18th designated blocking positions west and northwest of Brody with anti-tank artillery and motorised infantry, while tank brigades were instructed to avoid static engagements that would consume fuel and ammunition needed for exploitation. Terrain and weather shaped the crisis. The rolling wooded country east of Lviv reduced long-range visibility and favoured short, violent actions at road exits and bridge approaches. Rain showers on several afternoons turned unpaved shoulders into mud, slowing artillery displacement and ambulance traffic. Soviet engineers laid corduroy mats at critical choke points. German road units tried to keep withdrawal routes open by filling shell holes and clearing wrecks under fire. Bridges earmarked for demolition presented dilemmas. Blowing them too early would trap German units. Too late would permit Soviet tanks to cross in strength. Several demolitions succeeded in slowing the advance, but others failed when fuses were cut by artillery or charges were removed by assault engineers. Air activity intensified. 2nd Air Army shifted weight to interdiction of road movements behind German lines, flying concentrated sorties against columns on the Brody-Busk and Brody-Zolochiv roads, and against sidings feeding Rava-Ruska. Luftwaffe fighter-bomber units attacked Soviet bridge parks and traffic nodes, scoring hits on fuel trucks and pontoon trains. However, the numerical disparity limited persistence. German pilots could disrupt individual crossings, but could not sustain coverage across the depth of the front. Soviet fighter coverage reduced daylight exposure for bridging, though losses occurred when aircraft strafed roads already under anti-aircraft protection. Casualty and logistics reports revealed the cost and tempo. Soviet rifle divisions in 1st Echelon Corps recorded daily personnel losses in the low hundreds per division during assaults on fortified villages and in minefield breaches. Engineer battalions reported similar rates when clearing obstacles under direct fire. Tank brigades registered combat write-offs and non-combat losses from transmission failures after repeated short bounds. Ammunition expenditure exceeded planned norms. 122mm and 152mm howitzer units fired well above the schedule on days of counter-battery duels and urban reductions. On the German side, infantry battalions in sectors subjected to successive barrages reported frontline strengths eroding to company-sized elements. Assault gun batteries also noted losses from artillery and close-range anti-tank ambushes along hedgerows. Fuel remained the limiting factor for panzer counterstrokes. Several planned actions were reduced in scale or cancelled when allocations could not be delivered through interdicted rail nodes. Political and civil dimensions intersected with military operations. In Lviv, underground Polish formations launched actions as part of a broader effort to establish authority before the arrival of Soviet forces. Local clashes and negotiations occurred in different districts, while German military and police units concentrated on delaying the external advance and evacuating administrative offices. Soviet command noted these developments and issued instructions to maintain focus on military objectives while coordinating with advancing security units. Civilians continued to leave the likely battle zones. Hospitals in towns west of the city expanded capacity for both military and civilian wounded. and railcars were allocated to evacuate medical staff and equipment when possible. The encirclement around Brody approached closure as Soviet forces advancing from the north reached lines west of Olesko, and those from the south moved beyond the Ternopil-Lviv road, establishing anti-tank screens facing outward. German attempts to keep a corridor open centered on counterattacks by mixed groups of Panzer IVs, Panthers, and assault guns, with infantry riding on vehicles or following on bicycles and trucks. Several attacks regained ground in the morning, only to lose it by evening under renewed artillery and aircraft strikes. Corps headquarters appealed for a coordinated strike from the west to break the ring, but adjacent formations were already engaged in holding actions to protect Lviv's outer defences and to prevent Soviet units from reaching the bug crossings farther north. Urban pressure on Lviv increased. Soviet regiments tested outer neighbourhoods with reconnaissance in force, seeking weak points and aiming to tie German reserves. The city's street grid, industrial plants and railway yards offered cover and obstacles. German troops used basements, attics, and connecting walls for movement. Soviet assault groups responded with demolition charges, direct fire guns, and flamethrowers. The fighting remained at the periphery, while the main encirclement unfolded northeast of the city, but every reserve company committed inside Lviv reduced the capacity to assist the 13th Corps. Intelligence assessments at both headquarters reflected rising uncertainty. German situation maps showed multiple Soviet thrusts converging and noted that telephone lines to several divisions in the Brody sector had been cut for hours at a time. Aerial reconnaissance flights returned fewer interpretable images due to cloud and smoke. Soviet staff received partisan reports on German breakout preparations and railway demolitions west of the pocket, but also cautioned that German armour remained capable of short, intense counterstrokes against overextended spearheads. Orders emphasised maintaining strong anti-tank fronts on the ring and rotating assault battalions to conserve combat effectiveness. International and inter-front coordination influenced reinforcement flows. Requests from Army Group North Ukraine for additional armour competed with demands from other sectors affected by Bagration. The High Command assigned limited reinforcements, prioritising the defence of the Vistula line near Sandomierz and the protection of the approaches to Krakow. On the Soviet side, the General Staff directed Konev to secure bridgeheads on the Vistula as soon as the encirclement and Lviv objectives permitted, indicating that resources could be shifted northward once the pocket was eliminated. This guidance shaped allocation decisions. Fuel and bridging units were moved toward the northern axis, even before the final liquidation at Brody, signalling a transition from crisis management to preparation for the next operational phase. The psychological dimension was evident in unit diaries and after-action notes. Soviet accounts described the cumulative effect of repeated breaches and the importance of maintaining pace to prevent German recovery. German accounts stressed the strain of operating under constant observation and bombardment, the difficulty of night movements on congested roads, and the erosion of battalion leadership through casualty and exhaustion. Neither side portrayed the period as a single decisive event. Rather, escalation was experienced as a chain of engagements in which timing, traffic control, and immediate availability of small reserves determined outcomes at each locality. By 20th to 21st July, the crisis reached a point where tactical decisions directly drove operational results. The ring around Brody narrowed, German counterstrokes lacked the mass to open a sustained corridor, and Lviv's outer defences absorbed formations that could not be spared. Northward, pressure on Rava-Ruska threatened the stability of the entire line toward the western bug. Southward, German withdrawals aimed at establishing a shorter position along the Stry-Drohobish axis under continuous pursuit. The phase closed not with formal announcements, but with unit positions on the map, converging arrows around Brody, a tightening arc east of Lviv, and diverging logistics columns as both sides prepared for the next decisions, the destruction or escape of the encircled forces and the entry into the urban battle that had been building on the city's edge. Between 21st and 27th July, the operation reached its most intense phase as the encirclement northeast of Brody closed and pressure on Lviv and Rava-Ruska peaked. Soviet formations tightened the ring with outward-facing anti-tank fronts, while infantry and artillery reduced interior pockets. The trapped German grouping comprised corps troops and elements of multiple infantry divisions, security units, and the 14th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS, with attached artillery and assault guns. Estimates diverged. Soviet reports spoke of several tens of thousands surrounded. German post-war accounts listed lower figures, noting that a portion of units had already thinned out during the preceding withdrawals. The terrain, wooded belts, low ridges, and drained fields, limited long-range observation, and forced both sides into short engagements at road bends and clearings where artillery could be registered by sound and flash. Breakout efforts occurred on successive nights. German commanders organized columns with assault guns at the head, infantry in march packets, and rear guards prepared to destroy heavy equipment that could not move. They aimed west and southwest toward road segments still contested rather than firmly held. Soviet forces responded with pre-planned fire sacks. Artillery shifted by battalion volleys, and anti-tank guns covered expected exits with overlapping fields. Several attempts punched through first lines but stalled against second belts, or got channeled into marshy ground where vehicles bogged. A number of small groups slipped out via forest tracks. Others were broken up and scattered. By 22nd to 23rd July, the organized pocket fragmented, and Soviet formations reported the capture or destruction of most heavy weapons and transport left within the encirclement. German records from surviving units describe reassembly farther west, with heavily reduced strengths and the loss of much of their artillery. While the pocket was being eliminated, the fight for Lviv moved from outer localities to inner districts. Soviet infantry advanced on the northeast and east approaches with the direct fire support from 76mm and 122mm guns positioned at street corners and factory yards. Assault engineers breached barricades and cellars. Snipers and machine gun teams covered cross streets where defenders used upper floors and attics for enfilade fire. German units conducted a calibrated withdrawal, attempting to delay without becoming fixed, and prepared demolitions at bridges over the Poltva and branch lines around the main stations. The presence of Polish underground formations pursuing Operation Tempest added a local dimension. In several quarters they engaged German rear elements and attempted to secure municipal buildings, while Soviet field commands kept their focus on driving the German garrison out of the city and preventing the withdrawal from turning into a coherent repositioning to the west. Rava-Ruska, the rail junction anchoring the northern shoulder, came under intensified interdiction. Soviet air units struck sidings, water towers, and switchyards. Forward detachments cut minor roads and established observation over the junction. German counterattacks, with mixed panzer groups, delayed advances long enough to pass several trains westward. But repeated strikes and destroyed culverts progressively reduced throughput. By 26th to 27th July, Soviet ground forces entered the rail area, forcing German detachments to withdraw toward the Bug. The loss of the junction widened the operational breach and complicated any German attempt to pivot a new line across northeastern Galicia. The command decisions that shaped the peak days were explicit. Konev kept one tank army oriented north and northwest to exploit toward the San and Vistula, while assigning infantry armies to the urban fight. This distributed risk. Armoured formations conserved fuel and preserved operational shock for the next phase, while rifle formations accepted the higher personnel cost of close combat in city streets. On the German side, orders to hold Lviv at all costs were gradually replaced by authorizations to evacuate districts when threatened with encirclement, but these came late and varied by sector. As a result, several battalion groups were compelled to conduct breakouts under fire through exits already under Soviet observation. Civilian conditions in the urban zone reflected the density of combat. Tram lines were cut, water and power were intermittent. Hospitals operated out of basements with improvised operating rooms. Evacuation trains carried administrative staff westward when possible. Otherwise, convoys of horse-drawn carts and requisition trucks moved at night. Shelters filled with residents from districts near fighting, and municipal workers attempted to clear streets of rubble to keep ambulance routes open. On the Soviet side, military medical echelons staged collection points at schools and theatres converted into aid stations. Evacuation progressed by truck and rail eastward through depots at Zolochiv and Ternopil. German medical staff evacuated along parallel routes to the west, with field hospitals relocating under pressure and leaving behind cases that could not be moved. Casualty reporting during the peak varied by service and day. Soviet rifle divisions engaged inside Lviv recorded several hundred casualties per day in assault battalions and engineer companies, with tank support limited to short incursions where streets allowed. German garrison and rearguard units reported shrinking company strengths after block-to-block defence and increased rates of prisoner capture during final withdrawals. In the Brody sector, Soviet reports listed thousands of prisoners and captured guns after the fragmentation of the pocket. German accounts from units that reached friendly lines detailed the loss of heavy equipment and the dissolution of regiments into ad hoc groups. Both sides documented ammunition shortages in specific categories: anti-tank rounds for German batteries, demolition charges, and smoke for Soviet assault engineers, affecting the tempo of street fighting and counterattacks. Operationally, the days around July 27th marked the culmination. Soviet flags appeared on administrative buildings as organized German resistance inside Lviv ebbed and garrison elements slipped out along western exits covered by rearguards. Rava Ruska's loss, combined with the destruction of the pocket northeast of Brody, unhinged the entire position of 4th Panzer Army's northern wing. The immediate Soviet exploitation moved west toward the San and north toward Sandomierz, with traffic control units expanding road capacity for fuel and artillery columns. German formations attempted to establish a line east of the San, while gathering remnants from the encirclement and the city's evacuation. But the lack of heavy weapons and the displacement of corps-level communications reduced their ability to mount a coordinated stand. The material results of the peak phase were concrete: captured or destroyed artillery and vehicles in the pocket area, rail nodes no longer available for German logistics, urban districts cleared at the cost of dense infantry combat, and forward Soviet depots moved into former German facilities. The human results were visible in unit returns and hospital rosters that recorded the concentration of losses in assault troops, engineers, and rear guards. The operational map by the end of July showed a front line shifted decisively west, with Soviet spearheads already aiming for the Vistula crossings and German staffs recalculating defence based on fewer divisions and reduced mobility. The campaign's centre of gravity now moved to the river line and the nascent bridgeheads, where the next series of decisions would determine whether the gains from the peak week could be converted into a permanent position on the western bank. As the intensity of late July subsided, the operation entered a phase of consolidation and adaptation on both sides. Soviet formations emerging from the Lviv and Brody battles faced the dual task of reorganizing for renewed advance and stabilizing their newly extended logistics. German commands, while attempting to hold the San and Upper Vistula lines, struggled to integrate remnants of divisions shattered in the previous weeks. Both sides now operated in terrain where rivers, marshes, and urban corridors dictated tempo more than raw will or available manpower. The Red Army's first Ukrainian front moved quickly to exploit momentum. Tank armies that had been held back during the final street fighting around Lviv were released westward toward the San River, their forward detachments supported by mobile engineer and bridge units. Reconnaissance parties located crossing points, while 2nd Air Army provided cover against isolated Luftwaffe strikes. Supply units reopened the damaged rail line through Lviv within days, using captured rolling stock to deliver ammunition and fuel forward. Military engineers rebuilt bridges over the Poltva and tributaries of the Bug, laying prefabricated spans under constant rain and air harassment. The front staff issued new instructions to restore divisional strength by incorporating local conscripts and recovered wounded, a measure necessary to sustain the next drive towards Sandomierz. At the same time, Soviet formations adapted their tactics to the new environment. Instead of large frontal attacks, the emphasis shifted to mobile forward detachments, probing for weak points and using concentrated artillery only at decisive crossings. Tank and mechanized corps adopted shorter daily marches to conserve engines worn by the Galicia advance. Maintenance units set up workshops in captured industrial facilities in Lviv and Drohobych, repairing tanks and vehicles on site rather than shipping them east. Intelligence units compiled reports from captured documents in the Brody pocket to anticipate where German command would attempt to form its next line. These measures reflected a matured operational practice, balancing speed with logistical endurance. For the German side, adaptation meant survival through improvisation. Army Group North Ukraine, now redesignated as Army Group A, attempted to patch a defensive line along the San and Vistula rivers, using whatever formations remained combat-capable. Survivors from the Brody encirclement were reorganized into Kampfgruppen without organic artillery or heavy equipment. Rail movement of reinforcements from Germany and Hungary was impeded by bomb tracks and Soviet air raids on junctions at Krakow, Tarnow, and Yaroslavl. Commanders reported shortages of wire, mines, and even shovels to rebuild fortifications. Air reconnaissance, though limited, provided early warning of Soviet crossings, but the Luftwaffe could no longer deliver sustained ground support. Fuel rations for aircraft were reduced again at the end of July. Morale among German troops varied sharply. Some divisions arriving from quiet sectors retained cohesion and discipline, while remnants of destroyed units, especially those escaping from Brody, were physically exhausted and psychologically strained. Many officers wrote in their reports of troops unable to resist more than brief artillery bombardments before withdrawing to secondary positions. Efforts were made to establish blocking battalions with mixed security and police elements to enforce order, but these had little operational impact. The overarching objective, hold the Vistula bridgeheads and prevent a Soviet breakthrough into Silesia, remained intact, though most field commanders judged it beyond the means then available. Civilians in western Ukraine and southeastern Poland experienced both liberation and transition. Soviet authorities re-established local administrations, restored power and food distribution, and initiated investigations into occupation crimes. Mobilization commissions resumed conscription of men of draft age, many of whom were sent directly to replacement battalions for frontline armies. Refugees returning to the region found cities heavily damaged, Lviv's industrial quarter burned, and rail yards littered with wrecked wagons and locomotives. In rural districts, requisitioning of horses and carts for army needs resumed, creating friction between local populations and supply detachments. Meanwhile, west of the new front, German civil administrations prepared evacuation plans for the remaining civilian population east of the Vistula, anticipating that the next Soviet offensive might reach Krakow within weeks. Within the Red Army itself, adaptation extended beyond logistics to doctrine. Operational orders emphasized the use of combined arms groupings, infantry, tanks, engineers and artillery under unified control, rather than sequential waves. Commanders were instructed to preserve tank armies for exploitation, rather than commit them prematurely in urban or forested areas. Medical services reorganized to handle the cumulative effects of high summer casualties. Infectious disease prevention, field surgery, and psychological rest centers were prioritized. A significant proportion of the losses from the Lvov-Sandomierz campaign were now being recorded as sickness and exhaustion, rather than wounds reflecting the continuous tempo of operations since June. In the air, 2nd Air Army consolidated captured airfields around Lviv, Busk, and Sambir. Maintenance crews repaired runways, and radar units were deployed to improve early warning. Soviet fighters, now patrolled deeper into southeastern Poland, challenging Luftwaffe reconnaissance over the San crossings. German aircrews, flying from bases in Silesia, attempted to bomb pontoon bridges but met heavy flak. Despite local successes, they could not stem the accumulation of Soviet bridging material along the riverbanks. By early August, several bridgeheads existed on the eastern bank, and reconnaissance confirmed forward troop concentrations preparing to cross. Partisan and local resistance movements also adjusted to the shifting front. Soviet-aligned detachments provided intelligence on German troop concentrations west of the San, while Polish underground units operating farther north faced increasing tension with Soviet security organs entering the liberated zones. The complex political geography of the region, Polish, Ukrainian, Jewish and Russian communities dispersed across the former borderlands, added layers of uncertainty to the military map. Orders from Moscow stressed that the front's priority remained purely operational: secure crossings and destroy German reserves. Civil administration would follow under NKVD supervision once the front moved farther west. Logistics defined the boundaries of adaptation. Soviet depots consumed rail capacity at unprecedented rates. Trains of ammunition and fuel jammed sidings in and around Lviv. Temporary truck routes were marked across the recovered territory, and traffic control points enforced one-way movement schedules. Fuel consumption by mechanized units outpaced delivery, despite captured stocks. German staff reports mirrored the same constraint from the opposite direction. Bridges over the Vistula could handle only limited tonnage, and every destroyed span demanded engineer resources now scarce. Both sides recognized that whoever managed to sustain mobility over rivers and destroyed infrastructure would determine the campaign's next stage. By late July's end, Soviet troops were arrayed along a line stretching from the Carpathians to the Lower Bug, facing the reorganized German defense on the San and Upper Vistula. The pause was temporary. Konev's headquarters interpreted the relative quiet not as culmination, but as an interval for restoration before the next operation. The lessons of the preceding month, coordination of infantry and armour, balance between rapid advance and supply endurance, and the need to anticipate encirclement risks, were already being codified in operational summaries. For German commanders, the same lessons carried opposite implications. Defence through mobility had reached its limit, and new tactics would depend on delaying actions and natural obstacles. The campaign's midpoint had passed. Its outcome now depended on who could transform adaptation into a new offensive or a sustainable stand along the Vistula line. The turning point of the campaign emerged between 28th July and mid-August 1944, when the pursuit from Lviv converted into a series of river crossings that produced a durable Soviet position west of the Vistula. After Rava Ruska and the Brody Pocket, the main Soviet mobile echelons shifted north and northwest, seeking crossings near Lvov-Sandomierz and Sandomierz. Reconnaissance reported that German rearguards were still organizing field works along the east bank, while bridge demolitions on the west bank were incomplete. Konev issued orders to seize lodgements by night, using assault battalions with boats and ferries under smoke, and to push anti-tank guns across as soon as the first wave secured a strip deep enough to cover landing sites. On 29th to 31st July, rifle regiments of 1st Echelon armies established several small footholds. By 1st to 3rd August, coordinated crossings linked these into a continuous bridgehead. The lodgement's initial width was measured in tens of kilometres and its depth in single digits, but engineers had ferries operating by day under fighter cover, and pontoon spans were underway despite Luftwaffe harassment. German staff recognised the hazard a permanent bridgehead posed to the entire Upper Vistula line. Army Group A directed 4th Panzer Army to destroy the lodgement before it could expand, assembling available armour from 16th and 17th Panzer Divisions, reinforced by assault gun brigades and heavy tank detachments. Infantry divisions, many rebuilt from survivors of July, were tasked to hold the river's east bank and prevent further crossings. Air support from 8th Air Corps concentrated on pontoon parks and traffic nodes. The plan called for a rapid armoured thrust from Starzov and Opatov toward Baranov to split the bridgehead and drive Soviet forces back into the river. Fuel and ammunition allocations were prioritised for the counterstroke, even as other sectors reported shortages. Soviet command treated the bridgehead as an operational centre of gravity. Rather than commit tank armies to urban fighting farther south, Konev retained substantial armoured strength near the lodgement. Rifle Corps inside the bridgehead dug anti-tank trenches and sighted 45mm and 76mm guns on likely avenues of approach, while Guards tank and self-propelled gun units were kept in covered positions for counterblows. Artillery was ferried across in sequence, regimental pieces first, then 122mm and 152mm howitzers, creating a layered defence. Engineers marked one-way traffic loops from the ferry points to forward assembly areas to prevent congestion under air attack. 2nd Air Army layered fighter patrols over the spans and scheduled bomber strikes against German railheads feeding the counterattack. The decisive exchanges occurred between August 9th and August 14th. German armoured groups probed along multiple axes, then concentrated on a thrust aimed at the northern arc of the lodgement. The spearheads included Panthers, Panzer IVs, assault guns, and elements of a heavy tank battalion, fielding new heavy tanks. Initial gains bent the Soviet perimeter and overran outposts, but encountered pre-sighted anti-tank fronts and counterattacks by tank brigades operating in small packets from concealed orchards and village edges. Several German vehicles were lost to mines and artillery airbursts as they pushed into narrow lanes bordered by hedgerows and drainage ditches. Luftwaffe sorties struck pontoon approaches and briefly halted traffic, yet repairs and alternate ferry points restored flow by nightfall. In the course of these actions, Soviet units captured or destroyed a number of heavy tanks, some abandoned after mechanical failures and others knocked out at short range in ambushes near villages west of the river. Technical teams inspected the captured vehicles for intelligence and forwarded them to rear depots. Both sides recorded heavy expenditure. German panzer regiments depleted stocks of armour-piercing ammunition and requested emergency rail deliveries that could not match daily consumption. Soviet artillery fired at rates above planned norms to break up each armoured push, and engineer units reported losses while keeping bridges in service under bombing and shelling. Daily casualty returns from rifle divisions inside the lodgement rose during the counterattack window, concentrated in forward battalions and gun crews. German returns noted significant damage to armoured battalions and a rapid fall in infantry battalion strengths committed to riverbank fighting. Operationally, the failed attempt to erase the bridgehead fixed the outcome. By 15th August, the lodgement's perimeter stabilised and then expanded as second echelon Soviet formations crossed in strength. The bridgehead's width approached several dozen kilometres, with depth increasing to 20 to 30 kilometres along selected roads. Soviet staff extended traffic control west of the river, opening covered routes through woods to minimise exposure to air attack. Field depots for fuel and ammunition were established in captured villages, and repair workshops began operating in barns and factories. The presence of 2 functioning pontoon bridges plus multiple ferry sites allowed a sustained flow of supplies and replacements. German command now faced a dilemma. To continue attacking meant committing more armour into a defence that was growing denser by the day. To pull back would concede a jumping-off platform for future operations toward Krakow and the Silesian industrial belt. Reports from the panzer divisions recommended shortening the line and constructing a deeper blocking position covering the approaches from Baranov to Tarnów and Krakow. Higher headquarters weighed these proposals against directives to hold the river line. Reinforcements earmarked for the sector arrived in fragments, and transfers from other army groups were constrained by rail damage and competing crises along the front. Civilians on both banks experienced the turning point as a shift from transient fighting to a more permanent military presence. On the West Bank, villages inside the lodgment saw roads widened, billets established, and medical stations set up in schools and churches. Evacuations moved westward toward Tarnobrzeg and farther into central Poland. East of the river, German authorities restricted movement within a broad strip and requisitioned carts and boats for military use. Air raids increased around towns serving as supply nodes, producing additional displacement. The long-term significance of August's decision was not visible on a single day, but accumulated through a sequence of tactical outcomes. The Soviet side demonstrated the capacity to force a major river against organized resistance, sustain a bridgehead under coordinated ground and air counterattacks, and stock it sufficiently for future maneuver. The German side demonstrated an ability to mount sharp armored blows, but lacked the massed reserves and fuel to sustain them over multiple days against layered defences. By the end of the month, the bridgehead west of the Vistula had transitioned from a vulnerable foothold into an operational springboard. It locked 4th Panzer Army into a costly defensive arc and compelled Army Group A to disperse armour that might otherwise have stabilised sectors farther north. The turning point thus lay not in the capture of a single city, but in the irreversible establishment of a permanent Soviet presence west of the river, from which subsequent advances toward the Sands tributaries and eventually the approaches to Silesia could be prepared. Combat activity diminished unevenly after mid-August 1944. On the west bank of the Vistula near Lvov-Sandomierz, Soviet formations transitioned from expansion to consolidation, while along the San and in the foothills south of Przemysl, German units executed phased withdrawals to shorter lines. The end of the Lvov-Sandomierz operation in late August did not present as a single ceasefire day, but as a sequence of local decisions. Rearguards breaking contact at night, bridges prepared for demolition and then spared to expedite friendly movement, and divisions that had been engaged continuously since July rotated to second echelon to reconstitute. Staff journals on both sides recorded the change through logistics rather than proclamations. Artillery expenditure declined from peak rates. Ambulance traffic remained high, but shifted from trauma to disease and exhaustion, and rail schedules changed from assault deliveries to maintenance stocks. German withdrawals prioritized retention of bridgeheads and crossings that could anchor a new defense for early autumn. Corps reassembled mixed Kampfgruppen from remnants of divisions shattered at Brody and depleted in the Vistula counterattacks. Where bridges remained, engineers installed Bailey or trestle replacements and mined approach roads. The objective was to trade space for time, absorb replacements arriving from Germany and Hungary, and protect the corridor to Krakow and Silesia. Commanders reported uneven results. Panzer regiments could still deliver short counterblows against forward Soviet patrols, but infantry battalions frequently fell below effective strengths. Communications improved compared with July because the front contracted and rear area radio nets were re-established. Yet fuel allocations remained the limiting factor for mobile reserves. Soviet armies concluded the operation with a controlled pursuit to a line that could be supplied from newly reopened rails. The bridgehead west of the Vistula received a permanent engineer presence. Pontoon spans were replaced with heavier bridges capable of supporting continuous truck traffic. Ferry loops were reorganized to prioritize ammunition and medical evacuation during daylight and fuel by night. Rifle divisions inside the lodgment dug multiple anti-tank belts and created strongpoints in villages spaced to provide mutual support, while tank and mechanized corps were held in covered areas to counter any renewed German thrust. Behind the bridgehead, Lviv's rail yards returned to full function with captured locomotives. Depots were established in former German warehouses for fuel, 122mm and 152mm ammunition, and bridging stocks. Replacement battalions filled gaps in frontline regiments, with men called up locally and wounded returning from field hospitals. Casualty accounting entered staff reports as the armies paused. Front-level summaries compiled for July-August recorded total Soviet losses in the First Ukrainian Front exceeding 290,000 personnel, including killed and missing, as well as wounded and sick. The distribution was uneven. Rifle armies that breached fortified belts and fought in Lviv bore a higher share of irrecoverable losses. Engineer battalions suffered heavily in minefield clearance and bridge maintenance. Armoured formations reported fewer personnel casualties relative to infantry, but substantial equipment attrition. German loss figures are more fragmented. Unit diaries indicate thousands of prisoners and abandoned guns taken in the Brody pocket. Panzer divisions reported hundreds of armoured fighting vehicles lost in July-August through combat and mechanical failure. Infantry divisions that withdrew to the San and Vistula listed battalion strengths reduced to company size. Soviet claims of prisoners and equipment captured around Brody and within the Vistula fighting exceeded German post-war totals, reflecting different counting methods and the chaotic conditions of breakout attempts. Civilian consequences followed the front line. In Lviv and towns along the advance, municipal records showed disrupted utilities, damaged industrial plants, and hospitals operating beyond capacity into September. Soviet authorities reinstated local administrations, reopened schools in reduced sessions, and conducted screenings of returning residents and men of draft age. Medical commissions prioritized the treatment of infectious disease that had spread during evacuations. West of the river, German authorities accelerated evacuations of administrative staff and families from Tarnobrzeg, Sandomierz, and smaller towns. Requisition of carts and boats continued into late August, further straining rural economies. Bomb damage to rail nodes at Tarnow and Krakow delayed both military and civilian traffic. Bridge demolitions created detours that increased travel time for relief supplies. POW processing reflected the scale of the operation. Soviet collection points near Brody, Busk, and later west of the Vistula registered prisoners by unit and rank, segregated medical cases, and transported them eastward by rail as capacity allowed. German accounts from soldiers who escaped the encirclement describe small groups filtering back through forest and marsh, arriving at German lines without heavy equipment and often without unit cohesion. Both sides reported intelligence exploitation of captured documents. German maps and code tables recovered at Brody informed Soviet assessments of defensive intentions. Soviet operational orders captured in skirmishes west of the Vistula were used by German staff to estimate likely axes of advance. Comparative casualty framing entered higher-level analyses as staff summarized the operation for political and military leadership. When set against Allied losses in the Normandy campaign during June to August 1944, front-level Soviet figures in Galicia and southeastern Poland for July-August fell into a similar or higher order of magnitude in total numbers, although compiled over different terrain and operational methods. The Soviet tally aggregated infantry heavy assaults on fortified belts, urban fighting, and forced river crossings. Allied figures in Normandy reflected amphibious landings, bocage battles, and urban reductions across a similar time span. German losses were significant in both theatres, but differed in composition. In the east, entire corps were broken up by encirclement and counterattacks against bridgeheads. In the west, divisions were reduced by attritional engagements and the collapse during the Falaise fighting. These comparisons appeared in internal briefings, rather than public communiques in 1944, but they shaped post-war assessments of operational cost. Material recovery and redeployment underpinned the conclusion. Soviet repair teams restored workshops in Lviv and Drohobych to service tanks and vehicles, reducing turnaround time compared with shipping east. Ammunition resupply stabilized as rail tonnage increased. Fuel remained a constraint that required priority allocations to units guarding and expanding the Vistula lodgement. German engineers rebuilt sections of the Vistula line and prepared fallback positions covering the approaches to Krakow. Mine stocks and wire were redistributed to sectors judged most vulnerable. Air forces on both sides reduced sortie counts from peak levels. Soviet fighters maintained routine patrols over the bridgehead. Luftwaffe raids targeted bridges at night, but increasingly shifted to deeper strikes against rail lines feeding the lodgment, with mixed results due to flak and limited aircraft serviceability. Diplomatic and political signals accompanied the military pause. The Soviet leadership presented the liberation of western Ukraine and the entry into southeastern Poland as proof of sustained offensive capability. In German communications, the establishment of new defensive lines along the Vistula and San was framed as a controlled repositioning to protect the Reichsgebiet and key industrial areas. Local Polish and Ukrainian organizations adjusted to the new reality. Some sought accommodation with incoming authorities. Others anticipated further political conflict as security organs followed the armies. By the end of August, the withdrawal phase was largely complete. The front traced a new arc from the Carpathian foothills through the San Valley to the Vistula, with the Lvov-Sandomierz bridgehead as the principal Soviet position west of the river. German armies had reduced their frontage, incorporated surviving elements from units destroyed in July, and concentrated armor to cover likely Soviet breakout routes. The armies that had opened the operation on July 13th now stood reorganized for the next stage. The immediate aftermath was visible in the statistics file to headquarters. Personnel returns, ammunition balances, bridge capacities, rather than in ceremonial entries into cities. The campaign had converted geography into logistics. A rail-fed urban centre reoriented to the west, a river lodgment supplied across multiple spans, and a defending force positioned for delay rather than manoeuvre. What remained was the interpretation of these results, how the cost and the new line would shape subsequent operations, and the way this theatre would be remembered relative to better-known battles conducted at the same time. The results of the Lvov-Sandomierz campaign were measured not only in kilometres gained, but in the structures it established for the final year of the war, and in how later generations interpreted its cost. Militarily, the lodgment west of the Vistula, created in late July-August 1944, became the principal springboard for First Ukrainian Front's winter operation. In January 1945, formations launched from the Lvov-Sandomierz bridgehead to the Upper Oder and into Silesia, using depot networks, bridge sites, and traffic control procedures first organized in August. German staff histories identified the loss of this river line as a permanent reduction of maneuver options for Army Group A. Fuel-dependent counterstrokes from August onward had to operate against layered anti-tank defences with diminishing logistical support. The campaign also set a pattern for subsequent river operations: night crossings by assault echelons, early emplacement of anti-tank belts on the far bank, rapid ferrying of field artillery, and delayed commitment of tank armies until the lodgment was deep enough to absorb shock. For the German command, the legacy was a reorientation from elastic defence to a sequence of fixed stands on rivers and urban complexes. The breakup of formations around Brody and the failed counterattacks at the Vistula forced reconstitution of divisions as understrength Kampfgruppen. The cost in armoured fighting vehicles and trained crews constrained later efforts to defend the approaches to Krakow and the industrial belt of Upper Silesia. Post-war analyses by former Panzer officers emphasised that short, sharp local counterattacks could still disrupt Soviet schedules, but that the absence of operational reserves and the cumulative effects of interdicted railheads prevented exploitation beyond a single day. The attempt to erase the bridgehead consumed equipment that could not be replaced at comparable rates. Civilian and political outcomes extended beyond the operational map. The liberation of western Ukraine and entry into southeastern Poland precipitated administrative reinstallation, mobilization, and the beginning of post-war border adjustments. Lviv remained within the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Population movements and exchanges between Poland and Soviet Ukraine accelerated 1944 to 1946, altering the social composition of towns and districts traversed by the front. Municipal records from the second half of 1944 listed destroyed industrial plant, disrupted utilities, and housing shortages. Reconstruction priorities favoured rail lines and depots, that supported continued operations from the Vistula line. In the Polish hinterland west of the river, civil authorities prepared evacuations through late August as air raids and bridge demolitions impeded normal traffic. The immediate humanitarian footprint included crowded hospitals, disease control programs, and resource requisitions by both militaries that affected rural economies. The casualty arithmetic entered official files rather than public reports at the time. Front summaries compiled after the operation recorded over 290,000 total personnel losses in First Ukrainian Front for July-August, combining killed, missing, wounded, and sick. German losses are less uniform in surviving documentation. Tens of thousands of prisoners and abandoned guns were reported following the Brody encirclement. Panzer divisions engaged against the bridgehead recorded hundreds of armoured vehicles lost through combat and mechanical failure. Infantry divisions that withdrew to the San and Vistula reduced to company-sized battalions. When compared with Allied casualties in Normandy during June to August 1944, contemporary and post-war analyses place the eastern figures in a similar or higher range in absolute numbers, noting that counting rules differed. The comparison highlighted unlike operational problems, amphibious assault and bocage in the west, successive fortified belts, urban fighting, and opposed river crossings in the east. These internal comparisons were used for planning and evaluation. They did not figure prominently in wartime communiques. Why the campaign remained less visible internationally than events in France involves several layers of information and narrative. 1944. Western media attention focused on the cross-channel invasion, which involved national contingents whose publics had direct access to correspondence and imagery. Soviet information practice emphasized liberation milestones while withholding detailed loss data. Archival restrictions limited external research for decades. The operational design itself produced few single-point symbols, no dramatic beachhead landings, no isolated fortress with a named last stand. Instead, the record consists of synchronized breaches, a destroyed pocket northeast of Brody, street fighting in Lviv spread across districts, and a river lodgement built by engineering cadence and traffic scheduling. The absence of a singular emblem did not lessen the scale. It complicated transmission to later audiences. At the same time, local memories formed along different lines. In Western Ukraine, the operation entered public remembrance through liberation anniversaries, unit memorials, and post-war narratives that emphasized the return of state authority and the costs to rifle armies and engineers. In southeastern Poland, memory concentrated on evacuation, air raids, and the transformation of villages inside the bridgehead into permanent military zones for months. The Brody fighting acquired additional layers due to the presence of the 14th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS. Its losses and later political uses complicated commemoration in Ukrainian and Polish contexts. Polish underground operations in Lviv during late July added another thread, intersecting with but not determining the city's military outcome and shaping post-war discussions of sovereignty and resistance. Operational lessons extracted by both sides had durable effects. Soviet staffs codified procedures for multi-army artillery preparations, maskirovka at front scale, and the sequencing of echelons so that shock could be regenerated after urban battles. The ratio of infantry to armour in city fighting and the early ferrying of heavy artillery into bridgeheads appeared repeatedly in 1945 directives. German staffs, writing after the war, underscored the necessity of pre-planned demolition and bridge denial, the operational risk of fixed hold at all costs orders in sectors exposed to encirclement, and the limits of fuel-constrained armour used for repeated frontal counterattacks against prepared anti-tank zones. These conclusions informed post-war military studies on both sides of the subsequent political divide. The historical significance of Lvov-Sandomierz therefore lies in three converging outcomes. First, it removed the last German-controlled corridor across western Ukraine, realigned logistics through Lviv to the west, and established a bridgehead that anchored the winter offensive to the Oder. Second, it imposed irreversible attrition on German infantry and armour in a period when replacements and fuel were inadequate, reducing the capacity to mount operational responses in southern Poland. Third, it created a statistical and archival record of loss that, once accessible, altered comparative assessments of summer 1944. The Eastern Theatre absorbed and inflicted totals comparable to better-known Western operations over a similar period, within a different tactical and geographical framework. The campaign's relative obscurity outside the region reflects differences in wartime reporting, later archival access, and the narrative preferences of audiences. Its legacy on the ground is the line of bridges, depots, and routes first forced in July-August 1944, and the communities that rebuilt around them after the front moved on.